Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Future of XYZ. With us today, we are honored to have Eric Blank join us to talk about the future of renewable energy. Eric, welcome to Future of XYZ.
Thanks so much for having me. Greatly appreciate it and looking forward to the conversation.
Well, you have a fascinating background. You've been in renewable energies for over 35 years, and in early 2021, you were appointed by the governor of Colorado and then, confirmed by the Senate for a 4-year term as the chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. I want to, just based on your background, we'll get to where you see the future going. There's lots of momentum right now. But before we even talk about your role, can you give us what we're working with as a definition of renewable energy?
Yeah, sure. Generally, it's resources that may have some capital costs, but no fuel costs. So it's wind energy, which relies on the wind, solar energy, which relies on the sun, are the two main ones. But there's others: tidal power, which relies on the movement of ocean; geothermal, which relies on heat on the earth; hydroelectric, which relies on the movement of water. So there's lots of renewables, and, the definition can go back and forth depending on how intrusive the investment is required to capture the renewable resource.
So what you're suggesting in a reasonably cynical manner, as an economist with a degree from the London School of Economics, not to mention a legal degree from Yale, is that in fact there is capital, there's an economic implication for how we define renewables. It's not only about the fact that they are not necessarily finite in their nature.
Correct. The fuel may be ongoing, but the cost is definitely not zero. So exactly.
Well, I think what's interesting about that definition, and I appreciate it because the EPA, at least in America, and the Environmental Protection Agency, which is our federal bureau for protection of the environment for all ostensible purposes, is very, very specific about their definition and does not get into the economics. And yet, when we think about the movement towards renewables and everything that we're trying to happen, and we're going to talk about this, there is obviously an investment that is required, and there are jobs that are needed. There is upskilling and training that is related to renewables. But I don't want to get too far there because I think that talks about where we are in our future. I want to talk about looking backwards a little bit, your 35-year history in the state of Colorado on solar, on wind, and now in a Public Utilities Commission capacity. What are some of the biggest changes that you've seen in the energy sector, and especially towards renewables, and kind of where are we today?
So when I got into wind in 1999, almost 23 years ago, and we formed a wind development company when there was no wind industry. There was basically zero wind outside California, and we developed some of the first wind farms in the East and the Midwest, and now it's $100 billion plus industry. The costs have fallen, somewhere between a factor of 10 and a factor of 100, 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. And a very similar thing for solar. We got into the solar business in 2008. There was no utility scale solar business outside California, and at one point we had helped develop the largest operating solar projects in the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic and Georgia and Colorado. And again, the cost of solar has come down by somewhere between 1 order of magnitude and 2 orders of magnitude. So I'd say the biggest change I've seen in my career is how far the costs have come down, where something that was fundamentally uneconomic has turned into something that is economic. It's just cheaper in many instances and applications.
Basic economies of scale, though, isn't it? From a business perspective, the more adoption there is and the more innovation there is, the more the costs come down because the more there's being produced. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, Yeah, it's definitely economies of scale. It's technological improvement. It's just solving problems. For wind, for example, the taller the towers and the larger swept area of the blades, the more efficient it gets per machine. So, like, the cost per machine have gone up, but the output per machine has gone up by a factor of 2 to 5 times more quickly. And we're just so much more efficient in terms of how we install, solar facilities. So in some ways it's commoditizing something. So economies of scale, technological change, and just getting smarter over
And
time.
what is the role of what are the role of subsidies? I mean, in the form of incentives by the government, whether federal or local or state, whether by grants and loans and other kind of programs or frankly, certificate trading. I mean, like, what is the role of subsidies in helping move the change that you've seen along?
Well, I mean, there's policy support at all kinds of level, and I just say everything's subsidized in this country. So subsidized is maybe a tough word, but in wind, the fundamental driver was the Energy Policy Act of 1992, which was passed by President George H.W. Bush, and it took 8 or 10 years to fully get the commercialization of that technology started. But the wind production tax credit at the federal level is still a critical driver of the wind industry. And likewise, the solar investment tax credit was extended for 8 years under President Obama in 2009 as part of the American Recovery Act. So the federal tax credits are probably the single biggest driver of both wind and solar. And now you have the Inflation Reduction Act, which now spreads those tax credits over 8 or 10 other technologies: geothermal, capture and sequestration, electric vehicles. So you really have a once in a generation opportunity with the Inflation Reduction Act to see the way forward. And of course, there's other real leadership at the city and state level as well. But the federal tax incentives are probably the single most important driver.
I want to come back to kind of the local and state level, but I want to be more global for a second, because I think most people who are watching or listening to us talk about the future of renewable energy today have at least heard about the Paris Climate Agreement that was signed by almost 100 countries in 2015, and is really looked at as the path forward. And it gets us as the U.S. that we've re-entered to net zero being net zero carbon emissions by the year 2050. At COP27 this last fall, there was a discussion that for the world to meet the climate objectives outlined in the Paris Climate Agreement, there would need to be at least $4 trillion a year of global investment in innovations in renewable energies in order for us to achieve these goals, at least for the next, 6 to 7 years. Does that seem like a realistic vision? Are we moving in that direction? What is your take on that?
So as a state regulator, I will not comment on international climate change exchanges. But what I will say at the state level is, Colorado has binding targets on our utilities to reduce CO2 emissions by 80% by 2030. And I think our state legislature found that was consistent with the requirements of the science and sort of other targets in 2050. And that will require really quite large investments. And for a state like Colorado, we're spending $10 or $15 billion just over the next 10 years in investment to meet those targets, comply with state statute, and because it's more or less economic. At one point, I hope we would be able to lower rates in nominal dollars, but I think we can make sure rates grow less slowly than inflation. So I'm grounded in customer economics, the costs, resource costs, and retaining an affordable, reliable electric system, energy system. So that to me, that's the next 10 years, and it is an enormous it's an enormous transition. In Colorado is, I don't know what, 2, 3, 4% of the U.S. economy. So if we're spending, $15 billion by the end of the decade, you can multiply that by, 20 to 25 times. And, you can see, we're not that far away from $1 trillion in investment.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the International Energy Agency, I think, has said that, obviously renewable electricity expansion is going to be doubling over the next period because of some of the agreements made. And yeah, in the U.S., of course, we are going state by state. You had mentioned before talking a lot about wind and solar, which from my research, at least, they are the top two forms of renewable energy. And yet, although they are growing rapidly, they only account for about 5% of our energy production today in the U.S. Does that sound right? And how is Colorado kind of fit into the best of or worst within the United States? And in your function today, like, what are you doing to move Colorado forward within kind of best practices?
So I'd say Colorado is, I think solar may be around 5%. I think wind is a little higher. And Colorado is definitely above the national average. We don't have the best wind. That's more in the middle of the country. We may not have the best solar because that's more in the Southwest. But we may have among the best wind and solar. So we're trying to lead the way forward. I guess it's a small percentage off a very large base. But if you look at the incremental wind and solar capacity, it's a very large percentage of the new capacity. It's maybe half or more in most places. So, it's just going to take time, and it has to be done in a way that's thoughtful, smart, creates affordable electricity, and is fair to, our most disadvantaged customers and the communities that are going to bear the brunt of this transition. It's a complicated transition with real equity, affordability, reliability concerns that has to be done correctly, and probably with some notion of incrementalism. So
it makes sense because also, just talking about Colorado, you guys are still the 5th largest crude oil producing state in the country, 7th on natural gases, I believe. While this transition is happening, as you say, I won't say it's a slow burn, but it is a transition. And as with all transitions, as you say, there's pain and in the change. So what are some of the things that, if you think outside of Colorado, to other states and or other nations? China is an example where there's so much investment in renewables, but of course that is at a fundamentally federal level. What are some of the places that you're looking at that are transitioning well, faster, better, and saying, what can we learn from them?
Well, I'd say in Colorado, it turns out that most of our existing coal plants, seem to be aging and expensive. So we found that we can often economically retire them and replace them with a mix of, peaking capacity, wind, solar, and some storage in ways that, are economic, maintain system reliability, and can reduce emissions. So it's like this win-win-win path forward. But if you look at China, I agree with you. They're building enormous amounts of new renewable energy. but they're also continuing to build new fossil fuel generation in enormous quantities. And, I think it's going to, multi-trillion-dollar investments that I think are at risk and are going to make it very tough for them to, move forward. So I think this country and Colorado are much better positioned, to find that affordable, reliable path forward.
It's a fascinating kind of look at kind of pursuing two strategies simultaneously. And one of the things that I was fascinated to learn is that some of the past subsidies, let's call them, Chapter 313 as being one of them, is simultaneously giving large oil and gas companies, for instance, credits where they're still producing fossil fuels in other states. And so there are always in change, especially in business and in major things that are demanded by so many people, i.e. energy, as one of the biggest consumables in our planet today. There are always what we call in business externalities, right? Unintended consequences. One of the things that I think from your 35-year history and your role, obviously, at the Colorado Public Utilities Commission is trying, as you say, to find equitable distribution to try to move the needle forward in the course of the 4 short years that you're appointed to this role. What are some of the things that you foresee coming down the pipeline, let's say in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, in terms of renewable energies and carbon reduction?
Yeah. So, it's not my job to set the, future environmental path. Our state legislature has told us what we're doing in Colorado. And, at the federal level, I think what the federal government has decided is a series of tax credits, incentives, funding support for a variety of technologies and, including oil, gas, coal. And our job as a state regulator or even at the federal level is to set the rules of the road so that competition can play out in a way that's, again, it's maybe a broken record, affordable, reliable, fair, in a way that's consistent with, the environmental goals that are set by either the U.S. Congress or the Colorado legislature. And I think, like I said before, the Inflation Reduction Act creates all these tax credits that have already been the key driver commercializing wind, the key driver commercializing solar, and now storage, geothermal, energy efficient. It's just like there's like 5 of them. and it's that competition, that technological change, that commercialization of new technologies that has to occur in a way that's, fair and, equitable to customers, investors, technology providers, developers. So that's the challenge to me of the next 10 years.
It is for sure the challenge. And so let's do a quick over under. Like, besides wind and solar, what are you betting biggest on is going to really, and I know it's a little bit localized, again, to your point about wind and solar and how they play and where they play, but at a global scale, where is your over under? Like, what is going to be the biggest surprise win of the next 10 years?
I think storage is going to be coming along, but, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I was investing, my own personal money into the answer to that question. And now I don't have to, it's just not my job anymore to predict winners and losers or set forward the winners and losers. My job is to let them compete and may the best technologies win. And, just to give you an answer, I think storage, lithium-ion battery storage is increasingly commercial and more broadly, electric motors and vehicles, EVs seem to be going forward. Heat pumps seem to be getting traction. The geothermal may increasingly be an option. I wouldn't ignore capture and sequestration technologies.
Carbon capture and sequestration.
Yeah, carbon capture and sequestration. Hydrogen, in our financial models is like almost break even just with the $3 a kilogram federal tax credit for 10 years. So
it's the Wild West again.
It's the Wild West. It'd be I was out trying to make money, now would be a good time. But this this job is setting the rules of the road. So in a way, we're an umpire calling balls and strikes, and trying to decide what's in front of us. So hopefully that's an answer without going trying to pick it. It's not my job to pick the winners and the losers.
It's a great answer. It kind of showcases the playing field, which is what you're again setting the rules for and calling balls and strikes. As we think about wrapping, Eric, there are obviously and still surprisingly, despite the science, there are climate change deniers. There are people who don't believe. However, with the warmest, winter on record in many ways, lowest snowfall, greatest rainfall. I mean, with so many climate-related incidences, I think people are beginning to really wake up to this is probably a thing. However, there are still naysayers. Obviously, there are climate ambitions that we are reaching towards for the betterment of the world and for people. There are also real energy security concerns, whether you believe in climate change or not. I want to finish with the question to you. We've talked about where do you see it going the next 5 to 10 years. But when you look ahead, having had such a strong base, for 35 years as an original pioneer of renewables, what is your greatest hope for the next 20 years? And in 20 years, where do you hope we are in terms of the future of renewable energy?
Well, and I just started out saying, I don't even think we need to fight over climate science anymore. My biggest hope is that there's now an economic regime in place where these set of technologies are just fundamentally cost effective. So it just seems like everything in this country is a partisan food fight, tribal warfare. And on this issue, I don't think there's a path forward unless we stop the partisan nonsense. There's just no path forward. This country has to come together to really meaningfully move forward. So my greatest hope is that we do it because it's economic and it's cost effective, not because one side or another wins the debate over climate science. And for the next 5 or 10 years, I think it is. I mean, at least in Colorado, this is not good. It's cost effective, and I think increasingly it's going to be that way everywhere. And I just hope we can move together as a country, because it's the economic thing to do, right? And I just think we got to stop the red versus blue food fight on this issue. And, I think someday if you can internalize the cost of carbon into world trade, I think it could be a real competitive advantage for this country as against China, which is, still building the new carbon infrastructure at great cost. So that's my biggest hope. And, I hope Colorado can help, at least in a small way, lead the way forward. I feel like we're trying to build a purple state model, a replicable national purple state model about how you do this affordable, reliably, fairly. So that's my goal. I'm not here to convince anybody on climate science.
I love it. It's
whatever. None of that. It's just, and increasingly as you electrify transportation, you spread the fixed cost of the electric system over a larger sales base, and it turns out on the eastern plains of Colorado, it's relatively cost effective to build wind and solar, and many of those communities want it and seek the economic development. So, again, I just think there's a win-win-win bipartisan way forward. So that's my greatest hope. We'll see.
Eric, I think it's a wonderful vision for the future, and I really thank you for sharing your incredible depth of knowledge on the topic of the future of renewable energy with us on Future of XYZ today.
It's been fantastic to appear with you, and thanks for the opportunity, and keep going. I love your stuff.
Thank you. I appreciate that. For everyone watching and listening, this has been episode 3 of our season 4, presented in partnership with Rhode Island PBS. You can find the video at ripbs.org/XYZ. You can find our podcast anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. And you can find us on Instagram at Future of XYZ to stay up to date. We will see you again in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, if you like what you've heard, please be sure to leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Eric, again, keep up the awesome work in Colorado. Thank you. And everyone listening, thank you too.
Likewise, you too. Take care.